our Feminist Research Alliance workshop, I believe now in its 4th or 5th year, and it's usually an in-house forum, and it's a real treat to have Dr. Carrigan here, coming from out of town and the other side of the country. She's an assistant professor of anthropology and science, technology, and society at the California Polytechnic State University in San Luis Obispo. Using ethnography, she investigates the historical and cultural dimensions of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, and why these high-status fields appear impervious to desegregation. Carrigan shares the findings from her research to foster welcoming environments for underrepresented groups in STEM, and help strengthen alliances between the liberal arts, scholars, and engineers and scientists to enhance civic engagement and challenge social injustices. Carrigan was recently awarded the very prestigious National Science Foundation Career Award, the Foundation's most prestigious award for early career faculty. Congrats on that. And she is investigating why racial and ethnic minorities and women are underrepresented in computer science and engineering faculty careers. And she intends to use the findings to develop educational tools aimed at reversing this trend. So join me in welcoming Dr. Carrigan.
Thank you very much. It's such a pleasure to be here. I really am very grateful that you invited me to speak with you today. So I have about 40 minutes, and then I'm going to take about 10 to 13 minutes of questions, and then I'll just, Anne-Marie's going to help me wrap up the Q&A. Nice to see you again. You too. And I'll just have a few recommendations. So I just want to go over my background so you understand like where I'm coming from and what motivates the work I do. And then I'm going to go over how I do my work, my methods and my methodology. What kind of intentionality is motivating my work. And then I'm going to go over my 4 research programs in my lab. And I'll take some questions, and then we'll just wrap up with some recommendations. So over the past 20 years, I've worked in industry, government, and now in academia. So I started here at a full-time internship in my undergraduate experience at the Women's Bureau of the Department of Labor, and in DC. And so I was able to see work with women who were in non-traditional fields and hear their stories, but also realize the statistics of women in male-dominated fields. So that's when my passion for understanding women's labor in the U.S. workforce, especially in non-traditional fields, was ignited. And then I spent a few years working as a global senior manager at Amazon.com. And this has fueled my interest in studying women's experiences in high-tech fields. And then for my graduate experience and my postdoc experience was at the University of Washington Advanced Program. And this is a National Science Foundation Center grant that advances women, helps women access and persist in science, technology, and engineering and mathematics fields. And this complemented the work I did at the Women's Bureau and really got me interested specifically in STEM. And finally, now I'm an assistant professor, as you've learned, at Cal Poly, which is a Polytechnic school. So it's a perfect place to work with students in science and engineering and learn more about their experience navigating those fields as well. So I also want to give credit to my intellectual lineage, the people who helped inspire me in grad school. First of all, this is Dr. Rachel Chapman. She's a medical feminist anthropologist who, when I talk about my methodologies, I want to make sure that she gets the credit for inspiring and helping educate me in that way. And then Devin Payne, who's a Marxist anthropologist who inspired me as well. And Joyce Yen and Dr. Eve Riskin are people I still work with today. And they are not only engineers, but they're also diversity scientists as well. And finally, my interest in how knowledge is produced and who gets a voice in knowledge production has also been very much inspired by Dr. Alison Wiley, who's both a philosopher and an archaeologist. I want to thank them for their stewardship in my life. I also want to thank without these 4 people, I wouldn't be standing in front of you here today. These are my parents. My mom was a teacher. My dad owned a bookstore. This is Dr. Rachel Chapman again, who again inspired the work I do to this very day, and my brother who keeps me lighthearted in the life of an academic. So thanks to them. So this is my lab. I have 4 research programs in my lab, and I wanted to describe to you, I'm going to spend the majority of my time today describing each of these programs with you and why they're important to me. But what motivates all 4 of my research programs are why do I do this work, and, which is the methodology, the theory of the research, and what shoulders I'm standing on to do this research. And I'll get into that in just a second, but also how I do this work. So let me share both of those with you, the how and why of my research programs. So first, the methodology here. Anthropologists are traditionally known to go across the world and study cultures that they don't know very well. They learn new languages and they immerse themselves in other cultures, and then they come back from their field site and write about what they learned, but they never are accountable to the communities that they researched and they studied in. So I am different than that. I've decided to study close to home some of the problems in my own culture. And this was also inspired by some of my research I did in Brazil, when a woman told me, you Americans travel the world with your backpack, but your bed at home is unmade. So I went home and decided to make my bed, and that's why I studied computer science and engineering in the US. And I'm also a feminist. I'm an intersectional feminist, which means instead of asking, I ask which women are being affected and in what place and context are they being affected. So this means that looking intersectionally at race and ethnicity, gender and sexuality, class, ability status, etc. So, and that's not just people's own individual identities that I look at feminism about, it's actually the broader social context and institutions of these social identity markers. And then my methods are ethnography. I'm going to get into critical ethnography in a minute. It means using ethnography to study power relations. And also I use case studies, and you'll see this in each of my programs. I use case studies to disseminate the knowledge that I learned. So not only do people learn this individually, but they can collectively work with the knowledge that I'm hoping to produce. So, methodology. In the academy, there's been a long-standing, what they call the science wars, some tension between positivism, the search for laws, and post-positivism, the search for meaning. And often there's a divide between qualitative and quantitative research. So the broader social movements of change in the United States in the 60s and 70s also had an impact on the academy. So the validity of positivism, empiricism, became under question. Search for universal truths, that truths can be found, laws can be found that are applicable at any time and in all places. And this became destabilized once the broader social movements were changed, like the civil rights movement, the gay liberation movement, the feminist movement, entered the academy. So people who had been historically excluded from the academy started to question this form of knowledge production. So feminists, indigenous, queer, critical race scholars, feminist scholars started to destabilize positivism, and that's where we have this post-positive move. And so I practice critical ethnography from the point of view of anthropology, but it hails from a lot of different people, a lot of different scholars come from different disciplines. But what we often use qualitative research. So what's the lived experience in a particular place? What's the partial knowledge coming from that particular place? And how can we use that to interrogate both the historical structures of domination, but also everyday practices of exclusion that are woven into our daily life? So to wrap up this critical ethnography piece, and I'll come back to this interpretive turn in a minute. So these broader social movements in the U.S. was the interpretive turn in anthropology, and we started trying to question the discipline's ties to colonialism, to neocolonialism, and globalization, and we want to combat violence and inequalities in our own institutions and our own personal levels. So I'm greatly inspired by one of my mentors at University of Washington, Nancy Hartsock, which says that the point of studying power relations is to change them. So this is what I mean by critical ethnography. I also call it action-oriented ethnography. I'm using my research to try to change the world. And what does this mean in terms of STEM? So one of the things I'm very committed to, this is another part of my methodology, is not fix the women. Women are not the problem. Sometimes it's blamed on women's choices, women's reproductive strategies. I am not an advocate of the philosophy espoused by Sheryl Sandberg. It's not women needing to lean in harder. There is a serious problem with our institutions. It's institutional powers that are holding women back from equality in the workforce, in the economy. But also I see this as not only an economic justice issue, but because when people are denied access and opportunities in institutions of power, it ripples in their families, in their communities, and in generations to come. So I see this as also a reproductive justice issue. So before I jump into my current research, I want to go back a little bit to the 8 years I spent at the University of Washington advanced program, where this is what inspired me to become so passionate about case studies. So I was hired to do case studies as a graduate researcher, and I wrote about 13 of them for our national workshops for leadership excellence and to advance diversity. And one of them was about interrupting bias in the faculty search, and I just happened to write it as a script, and it went over so well that I decided to work with these folks here in our drama department at the University of Washington and turned it into a film. And so the film was really well received. We got funding from the Luce Foundation to turn it to make 1,500 DVDs. And so I facilitated this film. It's a 5-minute film of this one moment of evaluating 4 candidates for a computer science faculty job. And I facilitated across the country. We disseminated all our DVDs. It got really great reviews at the American Society for Engineering Education, ASWE. And now we have it online, and we get 100 requests a month to view the film. And just this last night, I got somebody from the WPI is now instituting it regularly in their faculty searches. So it's a really great way. What I do these days, I use ethnography. So I interview people, I observe power dynamics, and then I write them into this case study. Then you can turn it to a film, and then you can disseminate it broadly. So case studies are a great way to help people strategize with each other, share collective knowledge, best practices on how to, like, say, interrupt bias or tackle some very sticky issues about inequity, discrimination, and sexism, and then come together and create the solutions together, that way making it a collective effort rather than one's own individual problem. This is why I love case studies, and this is going to help me tell you a little bit about why I'm excited about the Navigate project as well. So I'm going to start first with telling you a little bit about the Navigate project, because it's also a continuation of my love of case studies. So I'm working with Lisa Folk and your fearless leader, Glenna Beck, and we are putting on programs for graduate student women in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And we are not only equipping them individually to navigate some of the problems they may face in their career trajectory, but we're also having them come together in the case study workshops to strategize in small groups of how they are going to become change agents for the diversification of the scientific workforce. So how do they, so we know they're probably going to encounter some obstacles, whether it be racism or sexism or homophobia, and we want to equip them with the strategies to not have that not derail their career. And it's also important to note that we do so in a form of a retreat. So this is kind of a new trend I'm seeing in the social intellectual movement to advance women in science and engineering, is bringing women off-site where they can bond with each other and form peer mentorship networks to help them after the retreat's over with their strategies. So here's the team, and you'll note that we're an interdisciplinary team. So this is another trend I'm seeing in some of the successful projects that are helping destabilize, or desegregate STEM. And so we have people from medicine, people from engineering, we have people from education, and people from social sciences coming together. The program very broadly is first we tell the students why this is needed. Many of them already know, but sometimes some of them are gender agnostic and say, I don't see race, I don't see gender. And we tell them, here's some of the problems going on. And then we have keynote speakers who have survived and thrived in their fields and act as inspiration. I usually start kick off the retreat with telling students about the key concepts and common shortcuts they're going to see embedded implicitly in the case studies. That way they have a common language and a common framework by which to discuss the problems. And then they collectively strategize on how they're going to, what strategies they're going to take to solve the problem that we bring up in each of the case studies. I will also note that the case studies are much like, mine are based on ethnographic research I've done, and others are based on personal experience of our team members or people that our team members have mentored. So they're very personal stories. So now I'm also going to tell you about another student-based research program called Advancing Cultural Change, and this is part of my work at Cal Polytechnic, and it's also something I do with my own students. So here's one of my classes. This is fall 2015. I've taught 6 of these so far at Cal Poly in the past 4 years, and each one of them I assign a mini ethnography. So the students have to study the culture of their major, and so far I've had 680 students participate in this research. We have a huge data set. I'm going to share with you just one element from this data set that we're using related to case studies. So we collect a bunch of data on the major cultures of people's majors, and I also have a large group of research assistants. So these are some of my wonderful research assistants. They help collect additional data to fill in the gaps from the class assignment, and they also do a lot of data analysis, but they also write case studies. So I also have some California State University STEM Vista students. So after they graduate, they come back to my lab often, and they help me with some of the work. It's part of the American program. So one of the elements for my Advancing Cultural Change program is something I'm calling articulating a succinct description. Has anyone here ever heard of Clifford Geertz? Okay, people. Remember I mentioned the interpretive term in anthropology, where we went from trying to be empiricist to trying to understand meaning. Well, he advocates he's known for that interpretive term, right? And he tries to advocate what he calls a thick description. So you deep hang, he calls it, in the culture you're studying, and then you write a tome about what you've learned about that culture, very broad. But when I'm thinking about how I'm going to apply my anthropological knowledge and help desegregate STEM, I was thinking this thick description is not going to work, so how can we do this? So I'm calling it the case study method, using ethnography plus case study, articulated distinct description. And my students and I, these are some of my favorite RAs, I've worked really closely for many years, and we've been disseminating our knowledge by writing case studies based on the ethnographic data I get from my classroom assignments. And one of them, and then we wrote a paper about it for the American Society for Engineering Education, and it won Best Diversity Paper as a means to intervene in some of the problems that are faced in STEM. So here's what the method looks like. First, we collect data using ethnographic methods, and there's 2 moments of data collection, and then there's the probe. That'll go over in a second. So, as I mentioned, the undergraduate students study the cultures of their major, participant observation, interviews, autoethnography, built environment analysis, and then, and so I've mentioned this already, 680 undergraduates, excuse me. Then we do data analysis based on grounded theory, and then we try to create a succinct view of engineering culture and how students navigate that, and how liberal arts students are feeling at a Polytechnic regarding this. So that's written into the case studies, and then we facilitate the case studies with the public. So a lot of, we've done it at in mixed audiences, interdisciplinary audiences. It also, so not only does it disseminate the findings, but it helps galvanize critical consciousness, and it helps us get more data. And then, here are some of the findings I want to share with you from facilitating this. I have a long-standing relationship with someone in civil engineering. So they have a 200-person capstone that I've been presenting certain case studies in using this method. And we collect data during that cultural probe, that last moment. And then we use that cultural probe data to create more case studies. And so some of the students are feeling like, oh, I never thought about that before, I didn't know that. This is increasing both my awareness and my empathy. And some students, especially underrepresented students, are saying, oh my God, I live this every day, thanks for validating this. And then we have resistance. So resistance comes in a couple different forms, like this is stupid, this is useless, this is a waste of my time, or you're calling me a racist, you're calling me a sexist, I'm offended. And then also one of the findings is we're finding that the students are in mixed groups, so if there's more than one woman, more than one underrepresented minority member, the groups have a less resistance and have a greater positive response that they learn something rather than in a more homogeneous group. And then we've done it twice, so let me just go back for a second. Once we facilitated once in a civil engineering group, we collected this probe, and then we wrote a case study using word for word the words of the students from the first probe. And then we used that to create a brand new case study. It was really nuanced. And we got some more information about how students kind of still sympathized with the white male who was resisting. They were like, well, he seems kind of stereotypical. But even though we know that it's direct quotes from students from the class before. So now I want to talk about LATTICE. So LATTICE stands for Launching Academics on the Tenure Track, an Intentional Community in Engineering. It's also an interdisciplinary group where we go on we do 2 symposia, 2 retreats, similar to Navigate, 4 days at off-site. And so there's 2 elements to it. There's the 2 symposia, and there's also the ethnographic study. Let me tell you about the symposia first. The first, we wanted to see if we could adapt this model, this retreat/symposium model for intervening, helping women to navigate the difficulties of their career. And we wanted to see if we could adapt it both across disciplines and also across race and ethnicity. So the first one we're doing is we already did it, May 2017. These are all the participants and the senior panelists. And we did it with women in one of the most highly male-dominated fields, computer science and engineering. We brought all these women from across the country, faculty members, by the way, and we did a 4-day retreat, navigating tenure or starting a research lab or how to do good teaching, how to time management, and all this was infused with intersectional feminism as well. So here's the team. We're obviously diversity and inclusion is at the core of what we do together, and that's reflected in our team. We come from different social identities and different personal and professional backgrounds as well. So some of us identified by different races and ethnicities. Oops, sorry. Some of us are queer, some of us are straight, some of us have kids, some of us don't, and we have to navigate all these different parts of our social identity. But another element of it is some of us are engineers, some of us are scientists, some of us are social scientists as well. So it's similar to the Navigate team, being very interdisciplinary. So in short, the purpose is that we're trying to find coherence as an interdisciplinary group and also let us all have our own voices. We try to build rapport both socially and professionally. We try to advance change. We want to be a part of this social intellectual movement to desegregate STEM, especially in engineering, and we want to support female faculty careers, especially women of color. So our second symposium is going to be next year, and it's going to be it's going to be engineering more broadly, but it's only going to be for women of color. We're going to see if the model works across race and ethnicities as well.
But then to a broader group of universities?
No, it's going to be on engineering writ large rather than just computer science and engineering.
But is it still NC State and UW, or is
Yes. The same team, same model, but different
But the
participants
are,
in the symposium.
But then you're going to have 5 people. Where are they getting all these women of colour in engineering coming from?
We've got quite a network, especially from.
No, but then they're coming from other institutions, like those institutions.
Oh, I see what
don't
you're saying.
have
Yes. Okay. So these these 3 universities are just hosted us. Thank you. Thanks for helping me clarify that. Yes. So the people who attend the symposia are from across the entire United States. So we have right now, in the last symposium, we had more than 30 institutions represented. And so that's another element of difference, right? Having like teaching universities, comprehensive universities, our ones, yes.
So are you targeting schools that tend to have women and minorities like HBCUs and
Yes.
women's colleges?
Yes.
Okay.
So what I'm doing is as the ethnographer, not only am I studying the participants who come to the symposia, but I'm also studying us, the actual organizers, 8 of us. So when I say close to home, I don't just mean my backyard, I mean my very livelihood and my colleagues and friends. And so I ask, how do we as organizers remain attentive to the differences in our social identities and our disciplines to form a coherent group that advances the social intellectual movement for institutional change in engineering? A participatory action research means that the people who are being studied actually have a say in how they're being studied and what's produced from them being studied. So they get to help design and implement the research. We collaborate and we reach consensus on elements of the research. I a member check on every element, so every transcript gets reviewed by the person interviewed, and what's written about them they get to contest or they have to consent to before we publish anything together. So it's a little bit more long process, but it's definitely part of being a feminist researcher. 2 of our findings is that in order to, we have to engage across our differences, we have to explain our perspectives. So and in some of our meetings, we just bring our professional lives to the table and tell people what we're thinking through, what we're struggling with, and we talk through those perspectives, and also like how we've been trained and how we come to think of the problem is really different based on our disciplines. We also always check in, we're calling it semantic consensus. So sometimes the terms we use we don't always agree on, we use differently. So some of us, we have to talk in depth about what does social justice means, what does social change mean, what does it mean? We called ourselves a coherent group. That took 3 months to come to consensus on. And I know. And we also try to start like what is the difference between women of color and underrepresented and minority, and what do we want to use and how do we want to use it? And finally, to bridge some of our differences, we use storytelling. So if we want to maybe contest something or we want to share something really important to us, we use storytelling to do so. We also, much like a lot of feminist activism, we also intentionally breach the personal and professional. And we do so on our team, in our symposia, but also in our research outputs. So it's very interdisciplinary, and we don't shy away from being, using our emotions. I think emotions are very important in research, which goes against, again, positivism. And so we make sure that we are very explicit about what identities are most salient to us, why they're important to us, and we do a lot of trust building. So every meeting starts out with a half an hour of just sharing our personal lives or some of our professional struggles as well. And so then we do fun stuff together, like go on the Washington State Ferry and hang out together and have retreats together. But one of the things is a lot of people have studied how diversity efforts in science and engineering affect the people that are being serviced or when we're trying to help. We haven't really studied the change agents yet in this movement to desegregate STEM. And we're also making these methodological contributions because studying so close to home can be very tricky and you have to change the methods. And also we're trying to, again, value interdisciplinary work, even though it's hard sometimes. And you do this interdisciplinary work across multiple dimensions of difference. Now I'd like to talk to you about my recent career grant. It's called Valuing the Social in Computer Science and Engineering. And so I'm hoping to contribute qualitative theory to the problem of women and underrepresented minorities exclusion from computer science and engineering in particular. I want to test the innovative methods that I'm sharing with you today to see if those can help with the problem. And I want to create educational techniques for catalyzing institutional change, and that can be then adapted across different fields of study. So let me share with you my methods. I have a hypothesis. Computer science, I wanted to minimize variability. So computer science has a bunch of subfields. And some of them are highly male-dominated. For example, theory and algorithms is about 9–10% women. And then some of them are almost close to gender parity. For example, human-computer interaction. So I thought, why not compare two subfields within the same larger field of study to see why some have already solved the gender parity problem and what that culture looks like, and what is the culture and values and philosophies and politics of the highly male-dominated fields. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to use life history interviews, and then I'm going to start interviewing the network contacts of the program officers, the colleagues of these folks, their collaborators. I'm going to go to conferences and do informal interviews with larger groups in these fields. And I'm going to compare and contrast the cultures of these fields. And here's what I'm hoping to discern. I'm trying to identify the values and behaviors in these cultures to find out why they're so exclusionary. I'm also doing this like as cross-sectional as well, so I'm going to be sampling women of color, some white women, lesbian, and bisexual and transgender women, and I'm also going to see if I can across a different bunch of institutions as well and see if that yields any new findings as well. I'm looking at the attitudes towards race and gender and see if this has anything to do with women's representation. I'm trying to describe women's experience and how it's different from perhaps men's experience along vectors of race, ethnicity, gender, and sexuality. And I want to assess elements of the culture that either reproduce or challenge inequitable power relations. I have a few theories based on my past research. There's something very particular about the way masculinity becomes hegemonic within computer science in particular. And I call it the bro culture. Bro culture in high-tech fields, I know from personal experience, but also extensive research, is very combative. There's a hero myth. And there's also this intense crisis moment. So if you talk to anybody who works in high tech, they're always like, moving fast is really important. We got to get this in. Things on fire. Like everything's like going to crash if we don't like stay up all night and code with a Mountain Dew. And if you can't do that, then you're not worthy. I was at a conference and I heard this very senior male manager. I'll call it the company Transco. And he said he had two teams, a software team and a hardware team. And the hardware team was this mythical, I call it the geek mystique. Like, geeks used to be a social pariah, now they rule the world, Zuckerbergs, etc. And so there's this, it's not only within the institutions of high tech themselves, but it's also kind of in the broader public discourse, this hero myth about the computer science geek. And so this hardware team, there'd be a big deadline, this hardware team would be like, there's a bug in the code, we're not going to finish this, we have to stay up all night, order pizza, we're not going to shower for 3 days, and at the end they're like heroes, and the manager said he'd reward them. He had, every time there was like a big project, they'd get accolades, and they'll get bonuses, and there was a software team that was run by a woman, a majority women, and one day, apparently the software engineer director went up to the boss and said, you know, did you ever notice during all these launches that we finish on time, we go home at 5, and the product gets done, no big deal? And he's like, no, I never, and we don't get awards, she said, we don't get bonuses. And he said, no, I never noticed that. She said, do you think it just could be my managerial style, and maybe there's just a different way of doing things? And he realized he had this like light bulb effect, that this performance of heroism by the all-male team was part of this, what I'm calling this hegemonic masculinity of PhD. So this is part of the problem. It's part of the culture. I'm also going to share with you another element that I think is a problem in computer science. I'm probing a little bit more. Now, this here is a Microsoft Technical Awards. Every year, Microsoft takes out a full-page ad in the Seattle Times to reward some of their computer scientists for their heroism. And the in large print in the award, this was 2012, but I looked at 2012 and 2011, it said, leading the social revolution. And then you looked under, and this was the team getting, notice, is there anything you notice about this team? And then, so these social revolutionists, what it turns out they do is they track the bodily movements of people who play certain video games that Microsoft creates. And at in the very fine print it said, creating better video games, creating better products. And so I'm looking at this going, how is this revolutionary? How is this creating a social revolution? Exactly. So it's this term I coined called myth information, this huge gap. This is what science and technology scholars like myself do. We study what scientists say they do and what they actually do. And this huge gap is what I'm calling myth information. Is it a social revolution? And why are we not looking at maybe some of the downsides of the ubiquity of computer science? And so what's the gap between what computer science says it does for society and what its actual outputs are? I'm very concerned, and since I've been studying this, now the public discourse is starting to get a little bit more honest about, like, say, how social media is affecting both, individuals, children, and people, and people's relationships, but also our democracy itself. So, another concern I have, since I have a little time, I'm going to go into this. I'm very concerned with that tech is untaxed. So we have this huge amount of money being created, and it's all lining the linen pockets rather than going back into the communities that serve these institutions. I spent 15 years in Seattle. Amazon has become behemoth in Seattle. It's almost just a company town now. And the homelessness crisis has increased by 300% just in the past 5 years. They're not paying for roads, they're not paying for schools. They will donate some corporate philanthropy, just like Microsoft and Google and Adobe. They'll donate certain amount of money to the University of Washington. But it's only for STEM fields, feeds that feed right into their offices, and then a lot of the liberal arts are struggling. So this is another way that I feel, one of the many ways that tech needs to be interrogated for its lack of social good, its lack of serving the higher good, instead of just this rhetoric. So this relates to, here's my theoretical framework for my career award. There's a great emerging body of literature that I'm calling Gender Equity in STEM. It's mostly quantitative. It's a lot from social psychology that's saying that underrepresented groups, and by that I mean all scholars of color, women, and queer scholars, they want to have their careers and their contributions contribute to either their own communities or some form of social good or higher good. They want to be serving others. Now, I'm not saying this is not essentialist. I'm not saying people are born that way. I'm saying we're enculturated through the way we're raised to care about others or care about our careers. So there's an emerging scholarship that says because computer science pretends it serves a social good, there's a lot of attrition from the field once people get in there, especially underrepresented scholars. Once they get in there and realize they're either serving military purposes or corporate profit, and it's not fulfilling the social revolution that Microsoft purports, and Microsoft just being an example, really it's either keeping people from entering the field or it's helping people leave the field. And so I found this in my own research as well, and I want to contribute to that scholarship. But I'm also, because I'm a qualitative a researcher and very passionate about anthropology, there's also feminist science and technology studies. And we study the cultures of masculinity that I just shared with you a little bit. So I'm trying to combine this qualitative scholarship on the culture of engineering and tech, and also this quantitative research about how the public good factors into people's career choices, and how, and I want to keep pushing that interrogation of the rhetoric, the PR versus the actual outputs of computer science, because some of the folks in this field here, gender equity in STEM, are saying, well, we just have to change the image of computer science, and that'll fix the problem. And as an STS scholar, I'm saying, well, let's look first. Let's make sure that it really is serving the social good. So I'm going to take your questions in just a second, but I want to tell you the questions that keep me up at night. What's driving my next 10 years of my research? Who has a voice in STEM? Who doesn't? And why? How can we close the gap between the promise of STEM and the actual outputs and application of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics? And how can we best practice and value interdisciplinary work in order to solve the complex problems of our world? I really think we need to get over this epistemic bias against qualitative research. And I'm very proud to say my career grant was funded by an engineering directorate, even though it's 100% qualitative, because they are very concerned, NSF anyways, can be very concerned with the most marginalized people, what their experience is like in science and engineering, and how we can invite more of them and make it more welcoming. And you can't do that with quantitative methods, because you have to cut out what's not significant. And so the most marginalized, the smallest N, can't be represented unless you use qualitative research. So I do believe that, I think, will hopefully, with the support of not just the National Science Foundation, but people who care about the most marginalized people in engineering and science and technology, will also just come to value qualitative research so those voices can be heard. So, does anyone have any questions? Yes?
I have a question. So, you said that you want your research to bring about change, and you talk about the computer science field as being this sort of not very socially responsible
I'm concerned
field.
about that, yeah.
So, how would you imagine that injecting more women or diversity into that field might make it change and be different from what you described?
Mm-hmm.
Like, what do you think it should, what are you trying to achieve with changing computer science?
Great. I don't think the add and stir model is what I'm advocating for. I absolutely don't want to just, that's why I'm asking some of the folks in the gender equity field not to just say, let's change the public relations on how computer science is, and actually start to think about how.
Because it sounds like you don't just want more women in the field as it is, right?
No, I think it's very problematic, and I'd be very concerned. Because the women who I work with are hurting, and I don't want to put more people into that mix without changing it. So that's why I brought up the taxation piece, and that's a very broad problem, but it is something those of us, we're all citizens who can try to advocate for change at a civic level. And so I think that would be something that I'm very passionate about changing. That if they were, so think about Cupertino, Apple. There was a New York Times article where the president of the community college in that same town said if they just paid their taxes, we could serve so many students from a variety of backgrounds. But we can't, we're struggling that. We're really, he literally said it's decimating our community because they don't pay their taxes. And I've seen the effects in Seattle as well. I also think that the magic and usefulness of computer tools, I mean, it's in everything. It's in the car. If you bought a car since 2006, you're driving, it's now in our refrigerators, it's not just in our phone, it's in our phones. A lot of us do our research and think through some of the ideas that we want to contribute to the world using this technology. And I worry that if only 6% of the population, those with graduate degrees, white males from upper middle class, are the ones creating that, then a lot of voices are being left out of that. So, and the other thing is, going back to that emergent body of research that scholars of color and white women want to use their skills that they work really hard to get. It's getting a computer science degree is incredibly difficult, and they want to be able to use it to help others. So one of my research participants did this great project on eye tracking, so people with disabilities could use computers better. And so they developed an app and a product, and then Microsoft bought it in order to track consumer for advertising. She was so disappointed. She's like, we got a paper out of it, and I got bonded with my mentor, but it wasn't used for what it was purported to do. I was able to get access to Microsoft, and they had these very glossy PR materials that they give to faculty members to try to recruit cheap research and development from students into their labs. And they talk about saving the forest and the Amazon, and they talk about these things, but are they really producing those? And so I wonder if we could change the culture so that underrepresented computer scientists could contribute in the way they want to contribute, and then it was also being regulated by the public good and by our civic duties. If those two things could change, both from the inside and they were regulated from the outside, together, if we could have that social transformation, so then computer science companies and their academic components could actually live up to the promise that they're touting. That would be my dream. That's my life.
Two things. One, on that last point, I mean, the science per se is always sort of non-good or bad, and it's how people apply it. I mean, in medicine and in bio, this is all through. I mean, when I was young, they were trying to, someone who wanted to make soybeans grow better, because that's what most of the world did, and his work was the basis of the defoliants in the Vietnam War. So the work itself can't be. But another question I had on your two computer, the groups that you were studying, it sounded like you're studying from the cultures that are there. But by the time, I mean, the people, the women who are interested in that, or the socialization that went on way before even when they got into computer science, might make some people more interested in the interaction between the computers, and therefore when they get in, they'll influence the culture. So it might not be at the culture level that it's happening, but from the people who have been conditioned from birth to then go and change it. I mean, is that, I don't know if I made myself clear there.
So the enculturation of people in K through 12 might
Yeah.
affect who the kind
Or
of
0 to K too.
0 to K, yes, yes, and so there's you're absolutely right. There's a lot of amazing scholarship that's being done about how both. One, I'll give you Jane Margolis. You know, have you heard of Unlawful in Clubhouse? She talks about early on how people are enculturated to. So, for example, parents buy a home computer, and it's often found in the boys' room, and the girls have less access to it. So you're right. It starts in the home. I've decided to study secondary education and beyond. So my cross-sectional starts at undergrad and goes all the way to senior leaders. And I've done this because Jane Margolis says, if you have decent math scores and you have never touched a computer before, with the right education in college, you can be a successful computer scientist. Now I know whether you cross that threshold into that computer classroom is another question, but that could also be tinkered with in engineering education. So if we so a lot of engineering education rewards prior knowledge, especially in computer science. If we got rid of that, then people who just had some good math skills but not much computer skills at the secondary education level might be able to still contribute to the fields, even though I know there's been unequal access to computers 0 to 12. I agree with you there. But I just decided to have a focus. I didn't go to K through 12, but other people are doing great work.
Right. Well, I mean, it's also just that the women are more interested, just in terms of culture, obviously differences, that's something that appeals more.
Exactly. And you bring up a really good point about the culture of masculinity too, that I forgot to mention, thank you. And that is, there's some type of weird marriage or imbrication between technical competency and masculinity. It's not real, but the perception of it is very real. And so just being a male, and you see this in some studies that show like men who get a C in their computer class think, I'm going to be a rich software engineer, and women who get a B plus are like, I got to drop out. So there's a difference in how even our gender affects the way even we're doing well. So you're right. That's why I know we have to look at the culture in the fields, but we all, as you mentioned, we have a bigger problem too in the broader public domain. And so that's why I started the talk with these broader social movements in the streets that infiltrated education, that hopefully will influence what gets produced in their knowledge field. I'd like to take a question from a student or two. Yeah.
You mentioned that your research is qualitative.
Yes.
How do individual stories add to that qualitative?
Oh, they make up. That's why I became an anthropologist, because I grew up in a bookstore. I was an English undergrad, and I was obsessed with stories. And then I found Rachel Chapman, who I mentioned earlier. She told me I could turn stories. You can amalgamate stories and find patterns in people's stories, or even the outliers that don't fit the pattern. And those stories can become data. That data becomes theory. That theory gets filtered back into the broader social domain. And that's how I think this cycle between broader social activism, the academy, and our how theory can then influence society. So I think stories are the essence of my life, and I think these stories, that's why I want to be on the ground and hearing women say, I'm weary, or I'm tired of my war meetings at work, or I go, and also that's another reason why in LATTICE, we also tell our own personal stories about our lives. And I started today off a little bit sharing with you my family and my mentors, because I don't think we should bifurcate our personal lives from our professional lives, because we don't live them separated, we live them as one. Why do we pretend that they're not one? So I'm really glad that you asked that question, but I hope that I answered it.
It's a good answer. I want to broaden it from more computer science fields, but to medicine, to ask whether the same kind of qualitative research that you're doing for STEM fields and computers and engineering can be applied to medicine and individual stories. I mean, there's a lot of, STEM focus being placed on that field as well.
I agree.
It seems that your focus is more on computer science and engineering.
Yeah, I haven't delved much into medicine, but I happen to know that there is a difference in representation amongst the different medical fields. And what fascinates me actually is that medicine has this kind of social reputation for serving the higher good. So it does attract more women than, say, engineering, particular fields. And it even goes over to like biochemical engineering or environmental engineering. So medicine tends to, because of its social reputation, attract more women. But even within medical fields, then you have a stratification of representation too. So surgery is highly male-dominated. OBGYN has more women. So I think the qualitative research can help understand the differences between the different subfields in medicine. So you can compare and contrast with, okay, so why does family practice have so many women? Why does surgery not? Paid less. Surgery also, I know I have a friend who does pediatric surgery, and she works 90 hours a week just for residency. And think, her partner is is a stay-at-home husband, but, in our broader social domains, primary care responsibility, because of sexist divisions of labor in the home, influence if women are heterosexual. There isn't some evidence that lesbians have more egalitarian divisions of labor in the home, so that could be helpful too. So yes, I think we can definitely apply qualitative research to the fields of medicine. Also look at your medical school now. Well, who are the leaders in medical school? Who are the deans? Who are the associate deans? Who are the vice provosts in medicine? Who are the leaders? This is where the glass ceiling issue comes in too, and I think qualitative research could help with that. And qualitative research is being used in Australia. So Lisa will hook me up with some people at the University of Sydney who are actually doing qualitative research with very senior men in the medicine school, and they're trying to figure out how some men become change agents and why some men are resistant, and then they try to take the change agent stories and spread them, disseminate them widely. So I think that's another way qualitative research could be useful in schools of medicine. Yes.
You mentioned earlier that, and I agree that it's not ideal to just have more women and minorities in STEM as it is. The institutions and culture needs to change first, right? So, I mean, I come from anthropology too, my grad student.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah. So, do you see kind of some of the same problems in anthropology, even though it's a very, I don't want to say female dominated necessarily, but much more so in STEM. I mean, a lot of these
Many of the social sciences, yes,
still remain in the social sciences.
Well, I love this question because I'm living it, and there's a huge divide between the quantitative, so there's 4 fields of anthropology. There's archaeology, there's physical anthropology, there's cultural anthropology, and there's linguistic anthropology. And the more quantitative studies in anthropology, I don't know if you've noticed this, but are more male-dominated. So archaeology is incredibly male-dominated, and this is one of my mentors is an archaeologist, and she talks about the gender bias in interpreting, the bones and human history. But then you have cultural anthropology, which is highly female-dominated. And it's also 60% of cultural anthropologists are applied anthropologists. who want to use their work to change the world. So I think there is something, again, in anthropology about whether or not you can socially apply, if your methods allow you to be action-oriented, or if your methods are more tied to the empirical positivist history. That's where the gender divides. So when I'm probing this, the science wars, the difference between positivism and post-positivism, I see both a divide, I see it along lines of race, ethnicity, and gender too, and I see it in anthropology, for sure. Some people don't think I do real anthropology because I do qualitative research. Do you have a question, Karen?
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating how you're juggling the structural with the personal. And I'm sure you hear a lot of personal information and anecdotes in these stories and these interviews. I was wondering if you could share some of these stories or the repetitions you hear that galvanize you to continue this work, particular stories that are memorable, that for you represent precisely the issue that's going on in STEM and why it's not welcoming.
Oh, yeah.
So what,
Yeah.
I guess, I don't know, I'm coming from the humanities perspective, or maybe I'm just plain nosy, but like, what are the stories you keep hearing? And
Let me give you I'll give you two examples from two different of my research programs. My one related, I'll start with the one related to advancing cultural change, because as you're a humanities scholar, and I told you earlier before this started that there's a huge divide at my campus. It's a Polytechnic. And the engineers are lauded as heroes, like I was talking about earlier. In the liberal arts, one of my projects from Advancing Cultural Change is called majorism. The students have this emic term called majorism. And it means that it's that epistemological hierarchy. Science and engineering are more rigorous, they're harder. See how the masculinity is coming in here? And they are more legitimated. And so some liberal arts students are like, well, here's a quote off the top of my head. I guess I ask all the time what my major is, and I'm embarrassed to tell them I'm an English major. So I always try to preface it, well, I'm going to study, I'm pre-law and I'm studying English, or I'm going to get a business degree after this. And then they said, and they never ask me, they always have this hint of dubiousness, like, why are you studying that? What are you going to, here's their response, she said, what are you going to do with that? I saw this over and over again in the student debt, what are you going to do with that? And so to me, this majorism paper that I'm writing for my students is all about how science and engineering might also be tied to the economy. And so if you can't contribute productively to the neoliberalist economy, then you're useless. So another quote, students are like, people just tell me my major is easy, liberal arts students. They tell me I'm useless. Useless, can you imagine that? Like, just being dismissed like that. And so I became so upset about all that data that's coming from that large data set for my student assignments that I felt the need to write this paper and try to disseminate this knowledge and try to advocate on behalf of liberal arts students. Because you know what we're doing in liberal arts? We're teaching students critical consciousness. We're teaching them how to contribute to our democracy. We're teaching them to be critical thinkers who can then work with others to promote social and intellectual movements of change. We care about making sure students go out to the world and make it a better place, not just get a decent paycheck and contribute to Boeing's profits or something, you know? Yeah.
Can I just follow up with a related thought, which is if you're a woman in engineering and somebody asks you what your major is, you have faced with the same problem. You don't want to say you're an engineer because the next comment will be, oh, you must be a genius, and that causes cognitive dissonance because women can't be geniuses, we all know that. So they have the same problem, which is they can't just be proud of their major.
Oh my gosh, you just anticipated. So the next paper we're writing based on the same data set is what I'm calling socioeconomic sexism, right? So women are damned if they do go into engineering, and they're damned if they go into liberal arts.
Exactly.
So there's enculturated to go into liberal arts, and then they buck the norm, and then they still think shit. Yeah. So are they second class? Is that a violation of Title IX?
But going back to the cultural question, I am increasingly annoyed that our liberal arts faculty don't help the students find pride in their own disciplines. How the hell are they meant to be proud of their major if their own faculty are not giving them the argument for why you should be proud of your major and here's all the amazing
What I
things
call
that have come out of
internalized
that
majorism.
field.
So
Yeah,
even the
and
faculty
oh
are
my
internalized.
gosh.
Great turn of phrase.
I can't help you with the bottom line, provost, therefore I'm useless.
I must be useless.
So Carrie and I have a shared friend.
It's really frustrating.
And so you were talking about liberal arts faculty advocating for value of what we do. And so our mutual friend, Ryan Hatch, when I was telling, he's helping me with the majors. I keep bouncing ideas about the neoliberal university majors into him, and he says, you know what I tell my students? I am here to make you useless to capital. I want you to be a cog in the machine. And so in some ways he is advocating in that. And I think that's a quote from Lacan. Then he went into a long discourse in Lacan, which I know nothing about, and I could not talk to you about it right now. But anyway, some faculty are very proud of what we do, and some people have been enculturated within the neoliberal academy to not be able to think beyond the bottom line.
But you do have to earn a living.
I know.
Thing.
I'm trying hard.
So what I mean, it's for like I have friends in liberal arts and just general arts, and I'm a science. I'm a biochemist, and hey, I've gone through life being paid well for doing something I can't imagine not doing. And you know, you come through with this is what you want to do if you're in the arts or even the liberal arts, and what you're saying is all true. But after you get out, you do have to, you know, pay the rent, and so there is some pressure on people to be able to do that, and not like, you know, well, my husband will do it or my partner will do it, and that's a tough one to deal with.
But
One engineering student told me in the interview, he said, I won't survive if I'm not an engineer. I want to go into art. And I'm afraid I won't even survive. So the fear, so that relates to the economy. The precarity of our economy keeps getting, even for middle class people, becomes more and more risky. So I'm not blaming the students for feeling the internalized majors. I'm trying to contextualize it in the broader economy. Yeah.
I was just going to add that engineering students suffer from exactly the same anxiety about can I pay the bills as every other major. It turns out statistically they're probably wrong.
Right.
The same level of anxiety.
They do make more money, that's
They do make more
true.
money and they're less likely to be unemployed, it is true, but it doesn't resolve the anxiety. The anxiety for this generation of students is deep because it's rooted in the financial crisis and watching their parents struggle through, and their families and friends struggle through the fiscal crisis of 08, 09. It is a deep fear to not be able to pay the bills. And of course the social safety net just keeps evaporating. And
Exactly.
it's very clear.
So our students' anxiety.
Bring up a statistic. Supposedly, most CEOs are liberal arts majors, and they make very nice salaries.
Well, the founder of LinkedIn and Seek Guru were all liberal arts majors. And I just, someone tweeted that more history majors get into pre-med than biology, but I don't know if that's true. I have to look that up. But supposedly
Yes.
So, yeah, I went to liberal arts university at Wesleyan, and I think my experience has been that I think you need both. I think you need to be both. I mean, I was a neuroscience dance club major, and at Wesleyan, they really encourage, liberal arts institutions really encourage that kind of bridge, because they recognize that that's necessary. I think you do need the qualitative aspect, but you also really do need quantitative to make an argument to people who are going to fund your research. You know, you have to be practical, and I don't see, I think it's important to have these kinds of dialogues, but I wouldn't.
I'm not throwing out the
downplay
baby,
either.
yeah. That's why I'm valuing right here, I'm valuing interdisciplinary work. You can't have interdisciplinary work if you have a hierarchy of value. So if you can balance them and have them equal, that's the ideal, right?
I think part of the issue with the, oh, you're a liberal arts major, what are you going to do, is that there's sort of a language disconnect. You say, I'm an engineering major, well, I'm going to go do engineering. Engineering is the thing that you do. You can't go do English. But the variety of jobs that you can have from a liberal arts degree is so broad. And I tell my students this all the time, do whatever you like. If you're in the humanities, it doesn't matter if you do history, English, anthropology for a BA, just do the thing you like, because you have no idea where you're kind of gonna end up, and that's amazing. That you have so many diverse opportunities because you have the skills of the liberal arts degree. So I think that's part of the cultural issue, is that we're expecting them to know an answer, but the beauty of the liberal arts degree is that you don't need to know your answer.
Just a comment on the medicine. At UB, there aren't more history majors than bio-type majors in the med school. But as someone who's been on the medical admissions committee, if you come in with a history major and you're actually passionate about what you do and have done, you're looked at very favorably. So, another bio major, so it's helpful in terms, what we're looking for is people who have dedicated shown a dedication to something. And so, we have a bio major at UB, which is biomedical sciences, that isn't so well. We'd rather have history majors who were deeply into something than somebody who majored in biomedical science and just dabbled with a lot of things. So go history majors for medicine, but you're not the majority.
So that's supporting what you were saying, I think.
Well, so I want to comment on that. I work for the Clinical and Translational Science Institute, and one of the things that we're interested in is health disparities within Buffalo. And we're finding out that clinicians aren't always going to solve that. So we're teaming up with faith communities, with landscape architectures, and people from other disciplines who can contribute to this. One of the strengths of the University of Buffalo is that we have these 3 campuses in these 3 geographically distinct regions with people with these various focuses, and we can get people from the social science who are doing social work who can help to talk to a patient who has diabetes but can't really manage that because of the socioeconomic status. So I think the University of Buffalo and this dialogue here has a unique opportunity to bridge those interdisciplinary gaps because of our population and the location of its campuses.
Sounds like a good research site for
Yeah.
many of my
Yeah.
students.
Yeah.
Okay. So I just want to end with just four recommendations. There's 4 ways women deal with sexism in STEM. First, they internalize it, which results in imposter syndrome, thinking you're not good enough, what Mason was talking about. Or they desensitize, which means they often say, I don't see gender, I don't see race. It becomes color blindness or gender blindness, what I call gender agnostic students. And then they start to criticize. I think that's where we're getting to. So you start to question why some of these things are happening to you. And then when you collectivize, you talk to other people who might be experiencing that, you see the patterns. And once you're with other people to see these patterns, that's when you can start to change them. So thank you for your time and attention and your great questions.